I'd like to shift gears, and we're going to talk about relationships. I want to be savvy to you. We're over time.
Yeah.
We're okay, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to know that. But we're going to roll with Carolyn because of our delays. We don't want you to miss a thing, but I did want to say that. All right, young lady. Here you go.
Yay, the clicker.
The clicker.
Clicker's important to have. I remember which one goes forward and backwards. Okay. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about creating connection for couples, and as Leslie said earlier, this also can apply to other relationships with your parent, with your kid. But I'm going to focus mainly on couples as my example for this. So the first thing is I want to explain what I mean by connection. Connection is an emotional bond with another person. Scientists call it attachment, and it's actually a survival need right up there with food and shelter. When you're connected to someone, you tend to keep them close. You rely on them for support, and you reach out to them when you're troubled, and you miss them when they're away. And these are all things you do when you love someone. There are many benefits to a quality connection. These include an openness to the world around you, greater curiosity, a better ability to give and receive support. We understand and like ourselves better when we have good connections. We're more independent, and we're also more resilient when we're hurt emotionally. On the other hand, when you're isolated and lack connection, there are different difficulties with that. You can have higher blood pressure. There's actually a doubled risk of heart attack and stroke. You can suffer from feelings of helplessness and self-doubt. Our immune system is compromised, and our body is slower to heal. The Irish poet has said, "There is a huge and leaden loneliness settling like a frozen winter on so many humans." And this is in part because right now we're relying on one or two key connections or relationships, whereas in the past we had a whole community that could give us support. So when one of those connections is threatened, it's a big deal. In fact, rejection from a loved one will trigger the same pain center in the brain as when you're hurt physically. So when you say you have a broken heart, there's validity to that. It is truly like having pain. So when you run into conflict because you feel like that connection is threatened and might break, things can happen. Now, conflict by itself is not a problem. It's when we see a decrease in affection and responsiveness after that conflict that you have a problem. Sue Johnson, who is the founder of Emotionally Focused Couples Therapy, has said that this longing for emotional connection with those nearest to us is the emotional priority, overshadowing even the drive for food or sex. So when that connection is missing or weakened, we react. And when there's a conflict that tends to explode, because not all conflicts end up being a big deal, but those ones that explode on you and become something, you're fighting about the milk that someone forgot to bring home, and all of a sudden it's this huge deal and you're crying and the other person is slamming doors. Well, why is that? There's other stuff going on behind the scenes, so I'm going to go through the steps of that. First, you're triggered. And a trigger can be a look, tone of voice. It can also be something from your past that the situation is reminding you of on a subconscious level. For example, Johnny is watching too much TV. Please talk to him. I'm busy right now. That can start something. triggered by something like that, there's an emotional response. It's usually fear, and then it's followed by, typically for women, feelings of abandonment and being disconnected, and men typically feel rejected, inadequate, and like a failure, although these can go back and forth. So we've been triggered, we've had an emotional response, and now we have a physical reaction. Our heart beats faster. Our muscles tense. We might feel cold. This is the diffuse physical arousement that Leslie mentioned earlier. So far, all of this has really happened in just a second, or even less than a second, and it's happening in that primitive part of the brain that our teenagers are using so much. And this is not really controllable because it's happening behind the scenes. So once all that's happened, now our thinking brain starts to get involved, and it tries to make sense of all these alarm bells that are going off in our mind and in our body, and it wants to make sense. So it makes an interpretation that might not be conscious to you at the moment. You might have to think about it later and say, what was going on with me? For example, to our first comment about Johnny watching too much TV, the person hearing that might think that the other person thinks that he's inadequate, that he's a failure, and what if my partner leaves me? Whereas I'm busy right now could be interpreted as, you don't support me, I'm alone, I'm not important to you. What if you leave me? And it's the what if you leave me part that's key, that feeling that something might happen and you might lose this person. So most of the time when we have all this happening, we've got our trigger, emotional response, physical reaction, and interpretation. When all this is happening, most people don't just sit still and go, okay. Instead, we take action, and that's either fight or flight. So the fight is an anxious response according to attachment theory, and that's when you're demanding, criticizing, clinging, or pursuing. Example, you always take Johnny's side and never listen to me. Why can't you ever parent our child? That might not go over so well, but what the person's really trying to do is to reconnect and get an emotional connection and actually get some reassurance. It's just not working very well in that instance. Now the other opposite is the flight or avoidant response. And people who are doing this tend to become dismissive. They withdraw or detach. For example, you're making a big deal out of nothing and then leaving the room. And that's an obvious withdrawal. That person is actually trying to soothe or protect themselves and the relationship. So the objective of these two people is really not to keep things going and hurt the other person necessarily. It's to try to connect and protect. The problem with this is that you get into a cycle. So the more one person's pursuing the other, the more the other person falls back. So if I attack you, you're going to put up a wall. And if you put up a wall, I'm going to panic, and I'm going to come after you even more. And the other person's going to say, whoa. And that just keeps going and going. So there is a cycle. There's no beginning or end. There's no one person that's responsible or at fault for this. What you want to do is become aware of the cycle, perhaps come up with a name for it, so that as a couple or a partnership, you can say, whoa, that tornado thing is going on again. Maybe we need to step back for a moment so that you can short-circuit the cycle. Now, every time you have a conflict, you'll also have an opportunity to bond and to strengthen your connection. The way we do that is by talking to each other after we've calmed down and after the fight. So when one person's talking, they'll be talking about what triggered them, what their emotions were, what their fears were, what was going on for them, and also taking responsibility for their part of what went on. Whereas the person who's listening is listening in a non-defensive manner and offering reassurance. And once all that's been discussed, at the end, it's a good idea to talk about what could have been different and how could things have gone better. Love is a risky business. In order to have a good connection, you have to be vulnerable. And those talks that I was talking about, those require that you give something of yourself and expose yourself. I love this quote. Love is everything it's cracked up to be. It really is worth fighting for, being brave for, risking everything for. And trouble is, if you don't risk anything, your risk is even greater. Without the risk, the connection weakens. Now I have a handout that's on the table in the back of the room, and it's a spot for a discussion that you can have with your partner. It's called the ARE questionnaire, which answers the question, are you there for me? Are you with me? The A on that stands for accessible. Can I reach for you? And this refers to how comfortable you are with reaching out to your partner when you have a need for comfort or support. The R stands for responsive. Can I rely on you to respond to me emotionally? This is the other side of the coin. So you've reached out. How do you feel your partner's doing on responding back to you and providing the support that you need and the reaction that you need? How good are they doing at being with you? Finally, the E is engagement. Do I know you will value me and stay close? I really like this one. When you first got together, you were probably really into each other. And you wanted to know everything about the other person, hear about their day. You probably touched each other, sat really close. And this is something that you need to keep alive in your relationship. You need to keep building that friendship. So this part of the questionnaire speaks to that. Finally, I have recommendations for 2 books. The first is Hold Me Tight. Hold Me Tight does read a little bit like a workbook at parts because it has exercises in it to help you with short-circuiting that cycle and growing closer to your partner. And it is meant mostly for couples, so that's a couples book. Though you can probably use some of the things in there with teens. The second is Attached, and that's for scientifically minded. It's actually an easy read. It's not really technical, but they're talking about the science of attachment and how that plays into our relationships. That's the fight or flight response and how that affects us. Now, if you want to invest in some couples counseling, you can reach me at Ruby Hill Counseling. And also, if you're interested in an educational group based on Hold Me Tight, also contact me so that we can work towards getting you involved in that. That's the end of my presentation. Is there any questions that I might be able to answer for you?